And suddenly there was no pain. Suddenly I was incredibly conscious. I could breathe. I didn't hurt. And I even thought, how can this be? How can I possibly be okay? Like everybody I saw, I felt them. I knew them. I knew their love. I knew their hate. I knew their pain, their motivations, their joys, their sorrows. And I felt this overwhelming connection. I now call it a oneness. I was connected. I knew them. And I was in this most beautiful place. People can say heaven, the spirit world, the other side. The only word that comes close to what I was feeling is I was home. Maybe we're all shouting, "Where are you?" The near death experience was the result of an automobile accident, but we had been down in southern Utah among the Red Rocks and we were visiting family. It was the Easter weekend. Our two boys, Spencer, who was 7, and Griffin, who was just 14 months old, they had this big weekend of, hunting for Easter eggs and spending time with family. And it was the Monday morning after that that we were getting ready to head home. And there was some interesting things that happened on that morning. Specifically, we had said our goodbyes. We'd put everybody in the car, buckled everybody up in the car seats. I'd loaded all the luggage in, and we were in the car just getting ready to leave. And my wife, Tamara, as I'm just pulling away from the curb, she stopped me. She said, "Stop, wait." And I thought she had forgotten something. I put the car in park and I stopped. And she said to me, "I just want to say goodbye to mom and dad one more time." Which in that moment I thought, "Oh my goodness, we've already hugged. Women, what are we doing this for?" But I watched and I noticed as she jumped out of the car and she ran up to her mom and dad that were on the porch waiting like grandma and grandpa do. And I noticed how she not only hugged them, but she kissed them both. It was just this tender thing where she hugged her mom and kissed her mom and hugged her dad and kissed her dad, and then she ran back to the car and jumped in. And it's in hindsight. I wouldn't have thought much about that, but in hindsight, gosh, that was the last goodbye. And there was another moment in driving. And when I say moment, it's just a glance, it's a moment. I mean, life becomes a whole string of moments, just moment to moment to moment. But in this moment, I glanced in the rearview mirror just to look at traffic, but I happened to see Griffin, my little toddler boy, 14 months old, sound asleep in his car seat. And I thought, wow, he's sleeping. But I had this notion, he's our miracle boy. I mean, there had been complications in the first pregnancy and delivery, and we were told we may not ever have any more children. And here was our miracle boy. And I noticed details, even in a moment, even in a glance of like how long his eyelashes were and how his hands were sitting on the little tray in front of the car seat. And as I saw that, I heard Spencer behind me, my 7-year-old, and he was playing with little action figures he'd gotten in his Easter basket and making all the joyful noise of a little boy. And then I glanced over at Tamara, who had also reclined her seat back and she was sound asleep, but she was still holding on to my hand. I'm driving with this hand and she's holding on to my hand. And I had this moment of pure gratitude, seeing Griffin, hearing Spencer, and looking at Tamara and thinking, wow, we're 10 years into this marriage. We got these two beautiful boys, and she's still holding my hand, the way she did when we met in college. And I had a couple extra bucks to take her to a dollar movie, and it was this pure moment of gratitude. So, leading up to the near death experience, watching this last goodbye, this exchange between Tamara and her mom and dad, and then having this moment with a glance in the rearview mirror and feeling all of this, those are things that probably would have been no big deal, except in hindsight, they're a big deal. And it was about an hour after that things went badly. There was reports of crosswinds. There was reports of a pickup truck that was driving erratically on the interstate. The hardest thing, perhaps, about telling this story is I believe I may have dozed off at the wheel. I may have just nodded off for just a second, but whatever happened, I swerved to the right, I overcorrected to the left, and in overcorrecting, the car I lost control of the car and it began to roll. Not off the road, but down the road, propelled it 75 miles an hour. It was a horrific accident. I blacked out during all the rolling, but I'm told that the car probably rolled no less than 6 or 8 times. When it came to a complete stop, I was completely conscious, it's like I blacked out for the roll, but wow, the first thing I heard was Spencer, my seven-year-old, crying in the back seat, and, yeah, my thought was, "I've gotta get to him. I've gotta get to my boy." But that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat, I couldn't tell. There was all the broken glass, the smell of the gasoline. I mean, I was unaware of my injuries at the time. I knew I was in pain. I knew I was struggling to breathe, and I felt like I was gonna faint or pass out. What had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed and shattered. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My shoulder had been, my right arm was almost completely pulled off and pulled out. Um, my rib cage was damaged. My lungs were collapsing. The seatbelt had ruptured and, exposed all my intestines. I was an absolute mess. I didn't know any of that. I just knew my son was crying and I wanted to get to him. But that's when I realized that no one else was crying, and, I was aware at the scene of the accident that both Tamara, my wife, and Griffin, my youngest son, were gone, that they were killed instantly in the accident, and, I can't even describe the grief, the pain, the trauma, the regret, the guilt, um I work a lot on computers. There's this little control Z for undo, to undo, undo, and I just kept thinking, can I not undo? Can I just get those 3 seconds back? That's about the darkest moment a man can be in. Here I was, hysterical seven-year-old in the back seat that I can't get to. I'm pinned, I'm losing consciousness. I know half the family's gone, and I was driving the car. Um the guilt, the regret, and I don't share that to be morbid or graphic. It's just that's the state when this near death experience began. And in all that turmoil, light came. Light, like light came and surrounded me, tangible light. It was comforting. It was almost holding me in this horrible despair. And it felt as if I began to rise above the scene of the accident. And suddenly there was no pain. Suddenly I was incredibly conscious. I could breathe. I didn't hurt. And I even thought, how can this be? How can I possibly be okay? And then in all that light, Tamara, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, she was there with me, but she was very much alive, gorgeous, vibrant, but hysterical about the fact that I had to go back. She kept saying, "You can't stay, you can't stay, you can't be here. You've got to go back." And we had a conversation about if I stayed with her, Spencer would be orphaned, and we made the choice that I was coming back. I had to come back and raise our son. Now, somehow in that scenario, she knew she couldn't come back, and there was and I hate to even bring it up. There was head trauma that took her life, and I was aware of that at the scene. But there was no trauma in this scenario. She was perfect and whole, but she's like, "You've got to go back." And we made the choice, and I chose to come back. Now, it was interesting in doing that. We have no idea how powerful our thoughts are. I didn't have to think about, well, how do I get back? It was the intention. I'm going back, and it's almost like I was just whoosh, just like whisked, and then I found myself just wandering about, moving about a busy level one hospital, level one trauma center. It was instant. I mean, what I later found out is I had to be extricated from the car because of my injuries. I had to be airlifted or life flighted to, the closest level one trauma center. I was unaware of any of that. All I knew is I'd crashed the car. I'd said this profound goodbye. It felt as if I was just whooshed, to this hospital, and here I was moving around. When I say I, though, it was like my soul. I was moving about the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the families of patients. I was aware, almost 360 degrees aware of everything around me. And when I say aware, wow, like everybody I saw, I felt them. I knew them. I knew their love. I knew their hate. I knew their pain, their motivations, their joys, their sorrows. I knew them as well as I knew myself. And I felt this overwhelming connection. I now call it a oneness. I was connected. I knew them. Quick example, a nurse passed me completely unaware of me, but I felt in that moment abuse. I felt the abuse she had experienced as a child. And yet, in the same instant, it's like, wow, but look at her. Look at her here, serving, healing, helping, being. And it was that way of everyone I encountered. It's like I knew them. I knew everything about them, but I saw them in this magnificent state, this divine state, until I finally came up to a body laying on the gurney that I didn't feel anything from, which was odd given this connected experience I was having. So I stepped closer to look, and that's when I realized, oh my goodness, that's me. That's me. But it wasn't me. I was this soul, if you will, having this profound oneness scenario, and yet there was my body. There was the skin suit that I'd been navigating life in. And there was this profound sadness, and yet also this realization, this respect for the body. I mean, mine was so broken. That was the sadness. Wow, look at the broken body. There was an awareness of, wow, I never realized what an incredible machine my body was. I don't have to remind my heart to beat. I don't have to think about my lungs, breathing. I don't have to teach my eyes to see or my feet how to run. I mean, I saw this miracle the body is, and mine was so broken, and I knew I had to get back in it. And once again, I didn't have to figure out how to get back in. It was the conscious thought. As soon as the intention, I'm going back in, boom, then I was back into the body. But back to that guilt, that grief, that trauma, that regret, the pain, I mean, I was ventilated. They had a big tube, down my throat during the breathing from my lungs. My legs were obviously immobile because they had been crushed. My right arm was immobile. Um, they eventually tied down my left hand because I kept grabbing at all the medical equipment. But I was back in the body, back to the density and the pain and the emotional trauma. I mean, the emotional trauma that half the family had passed was far greater even than the physical pain. I mean, I was unconscious. I was in ICU and ventilated where I couldn't talk for weeks. I mean, I wasn't sharing any of this. Oddly enough, there was a doctor and a nurse in the trauma room, in the operating room. And they came to me months after the accident, or maybe it was a month, 2 months. I was still in the hospital, and I didn't recognize this man and woman. And I thought, well, how do I know them? How do I know them? And I didn't know them. They finally introduced themselves as, we were part of your trauma team. And the nurse, was the kindest. She sat down, and the doc kind of stood over in the corner and observed it. She said, "Wow, we're so glad you're doing so well. We didn't know if you were going to make it." And we began small talk that way. But then she started to cry. I mean, she teared up and the tears were running down. She said, "We've got to tell you why we came." And I was listening intently. And she said, "When you were life flighted in, and when we came into the trauma room, and through tears, she said, your wife was there. Your wife's spirit was there. She was in the trauma room. We saw her." And I'm listening to this, and I began to cry, thinking, wow, I know what I experienced, but I still hadn't said a word to anybody about it. And then I looked over at the doctor, and I almost wanted like verification. Is she telling me, And he nodded and he said, yeah, she was there. And he said, I saw her and she communicated with me. And I asked him, I said, what did she say? I mean, like, and I'm in tears now too. And it was interesting. He said she simply shared her gratitude for what we were doing to save your life. And I'm like, they had no idea I had made this deal. They had no idea that I had chosen to come back. And of course she was there. When he told me that, I said, of course that's who she is. Of course that's what she would be doing. And I had this instant trust of the doctor, and I thought, wow, if he's willing to share that, then I'm going to share what I experienced. And I did. And I thought, if I'm crazy, he can put me in the psych ward and get me the help I need to, but he just listened. And we've actually become dear friends. I mean, that was 26 years ago. Um, but that's the first time I shared with anybody what happened. Perhaps the biggest experience came after that. It was at the end of my hospital stay. Um, I'd gotten out of ICU. Like I say, I went from ICU to surgical recovery, back to ICU, back to surgical recovery. But at this point, I was in the rehabilitation wing of the hospital. I was just about ready to come home. And it's probably worth pointing out the two most profound experiences were at the scene of the accident, before narcotics could be administered. And then at the end of my hospital stay, when I'm off of the morphine and, all the drugs that go with those type of injuries, and I'm just in the rehabilitation wing. I had this profound experience at the end of my hospital stay where I'm in bed and they'd finally stabilized my abdominal injuries. I had a colostomy bag to deal with the intestines. Um, my right leg was in a brace sticking straight out. My right arm's in a sling because they're working on the shoulder and had reattached all that. And I'm finally able to roll on my side, however, and sleep. I had laid so long on my back, I'd rubbed all the hair off the back of my head. I was bald on the back of my head. But in this scenario, I was able to roll on my side and I fell into a deep sleep. And I felt that light come again, that tangible light come and surround me. And I was grieving so miserably. I was in such grief at having the family pass. Um, but this light, just like at the accident, felt tangible. It felt like it was comforting me. I began to rise above the hospital bed. But this time the light dispensed, it went away. And I was in this most beautiful place. People can say heaven, the spirit world, the other side. The only word that comes close to what I was feeling is I was home. I was home, and I I began to run. I was whole. I had both legs. I had a healthy body. I say. I mean, I suppose my soul was out of my body, but it felt so physical. Like I could feel the energy of the ground under my feet. I could feel the intelligence in my calves and thighs, and I was joyfully running, thinking I'm whole and I'm home. And then I got this knowing that I wasn't there to stay. And there was this corridor off to the left, and I knew intuitively I'm to go that way. So I began working my way down this corridor. And as I did, I could see at the end of the corridor was a crib. And Griffin, my son, at 14 months, he had still been sleeping in a crib at the time of the accident. And so I rushed to this crib. And I looked in the crib, and there was my little boy, sleeping as beautifully and as perfectly as when I glanced in that rearview mirror. I mean, the details, his eyelashes, and I swept him up in my arms, and it was so tangible. It felt so I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child. I mean, there's a weight and there's a heat, and I was feeling all of that, and I held him against me, and he was solid, and I could feel him breathing against my neck, and the senses were so alive. I leaned over and I smelled his hair. I used to do that when I was putting him to bed or what. I mean, I'd smell his hair, and I thought, this is my boy, and I began crying, holding him, so grateful that he was okay, and I was having this experience. But as I did this, there was this presence behind me, this overwhelming, cosmic, powerful presence. And I grew up in a conservative Christian home, and I'm thinking, well, that's God. That's God. And I'm holding my little boy, and this presence is coming closer, and I begin to have guilt come up in me, thinking my little boy's here because I crashed the car. I mean, his life was cut short because I overcorrected or lost control, and this presence is coming closer and closer, and the guilt is bubbling up, and the presence is right there. And I had this thought. I thought, I hope I can be forgiven. And in that thought is where the whole thing just, it's like the lid came off. I mean, and this almost felt tangible. These divine arms wrapped around and held me and my little boy. And it's almost like we just became connected in such a, like, oneness again. Like I was that, and that was me, and my little boy's right here. And then there was this download in my thought. I hope I can be forgiven. That the thought came, there's nothing to forgive. Everything is in divine order. And of course, I'm in so much sorrow and grief, and yet then I saw my life. I've learned it's called the life review, but my life flashed before my eyes. But I'm seeing it, and I'm seeing it almost from like God's perspective. Like I'm saying, well, that was a mistake, and I didn't mean to do that. And yet this communication in the arms of this divine being was, but what did you learn? What did you learn from that? What was the lesson? Not the guilt or the, like, what was the lesson? And I saw things, and I thought, well, that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. And God, if you will, the being that held me, said, well, that's your judgment of it, not mine. You are so loved. You're as loved as the little boy you hold. You're as perfect and precious and beloved and begotten as he is. And it was multiplied, because here I was holding my son, to me, who was perfect and was all that, and yet it was multiplied, and I'm in the arms of the divine. And it was a very personal experience, but I knew that it was true of every living soul. I mean, it's like the whole universe was watching this, and that love rippled out to everything and everyone. And one of the interesting things is, God said to me, I'm using that word, there's so many names, the divine, it was communicated to me that I was to exercise my will. And I'm thinking, well, here I am in the arms of God, and given my upbringing, oh no, it's your will be done. How can that possibly be? I can't exercise my will. And it was communicated, no, you exercise your will. That's how much we love you. My will has always been that you have free will, that you get to choose. God's will is that I have free will. And this communication's going on, and it wasn't necessarily words, it was just communication, downloads. And I was told, you can be mad at God your whole life because this accident was allowed to happen and half your family passed. And We love you anyway. That's acceptable, you know. I was told I could beat myself up my whole life because I was driving the car, and that was a choice. But I was given the third choice that I could give my son. I could hand him over. I could pass him over in trust, and that way it wouldn't feel like he's yanked from me. I would be exercising my will and giving him to God. And in all that love and all that beauty and all that peace and all that joy, you know, the grief was gone. I was able to kiss my little boy and hand him over and trust and and know that he was okay. And in doing that, then I woke up in the hospital bed, you know, back to the amputation and the colostomy and the brace and all that went on, and back to my grief. You know, I grieved as miserably as any man grieves. I don't want to pretend that I had this horrible accident and had some spiritual experiences and I was okay. No, I had a horrible accident. There was a near death experience or extended near death experience, and I grieved as miserably as anyone grieves, but I had a little different perspective. It's like, wow, free will and choice. You know, I can't change it, but I can choose perhaps how I might navigate it. And I know it hurts. I mean, my little son Spencer, who lost his mother and his little brother, and in some ways lost his father. You know, people would say to him, "Oh, your mom's in a better place." It would just enrage him. He'd say, "No, you know, the best place for her to be is with me. I want her in the kitchen. I want her at my house." And so I get that, but they're never lost. They're closer than we think. And even if we don't feel them, even if we don't see them, I had this profound near death experience. Spencer, my son, didn't. He was a little boy. He didn't have any of that. But we have angels, and they're not lost. They transform from our partner, sibling, you know, child, parent, friend, whatever that looks like. They transform into guardian angels. They're still connected to us. They still watch over us. They still cheer us on, and we're going to grieve. And I think they grieve too. I think in a different way they might miss us too. I think time might be different for them, but they're never lost. They're with us. We're connected. They look out for us. They watch over us, and they cheer for us, even as bad as it hurts. I'm convinced we'll see them again, and it might even be in a dream. Or it might even be that you just feel them in the breeze that blows through your hair, and you're like, wow, I feel them here. I don't think they're that far gone. I mean, gosh, I was able to heal. I got back to work. I was fit with a prosthetic limb. I was living my life. And yeah, an incredible woman. I wasn't dating, I wasn't looking. It was a work thing, but this incredible woman came into my life. And we were friends. I mean, it was long distance. She lived in Arizona, I lived in Utah. But I began to have feelings for her. And I felt guilty about that. But I was also angry. I ended up at my wife Tamra's grave, and I was picking a fight. I'm like, how dare you? You know, I mean, I'm limping around trying to raise our son, and you're in that beautiful place. And how dare you? You know, you left. And as I was doing this, I felt her there. All of a sudden, I felt her presence as if she was standing right behind me, and I was kind of face down in the grass. And she communicated to me that I could choose anyone I wanted, that she didn't want me to be alone, that I should choose joy. And I mentioned that I was having feelings for this other woman, for Tanya. And it's interesting what she told me. She said, Tanya will teach you unconditional love. She didn't say that's the one. She didn't say, she said you can choose whoever you want, but Tanya will teach you unconditional love. And that has played out to be true in many, many ways. So yeah, I mean, I had an experience, a visitation, if you will, that even was guiding me, or it wasn't really, maybe it wasn't guiding, but it was supporting me in my life, supporting me in my choice once again, you know? Many of my beliefs may have been reaffirmed. I believed in an afterlife. Well, now I experienced it, but it was not like I thought it would be. I believed that life was a test and God was going to judge me, and I was probably failing the test. What I experienced was such unconditional love that life is a gift. It's not a test. There is no pass or fail. It's an absolute divine gift, and there's beauty in all of it. I've come to the conclusion that there might be one cosmic rule, and that's free will and choice. We get to choose. We get to choose, and we'll experience the results of our choices. And there's all this love. We're simply here to learn, and we learn by our experiences, and our experiences are usually outlined by the choices we make. And it's a pretty cool cosmic university theory if you look at it that way. Wow, and free will. And all that free will, what do I choose to be? What choices do I choose to make? What do I shout to the whole universe? This is who I am. And then we experience the results of that. And we don't always control everything that happens to us. I mean, I wouldn't have chosen a crash or a wreck. I wouldn't choose a lot of things that happen to me, but somehow I feel that soul has a journey, and all those things, even the most challenging things, perhaps are the things that expand our soul in the greatest ways. And maybe that's love. I mean, I've read in holy books that God is love, and maybe that's love, that we get the full feature experience of life, and everything will expand our souls in the most beautiful way, and we get to choose how we navigate it. Maybe not what happens, but how we navigate it and what we learn from it. I have written books. The books to get are Knowing, and that's available on Amazon. Knowing is a compilation of my first two books. I Knew Their Hearts and Mile Marker 80, but Knowing encompasses those but has extended chapters and deeper insights. Spencer, my son, and I just wrote a children's book. Oh, it's a tender book. We collaborated on it. It's written from his innocence of a 7-year-old. It's called Where Are You? And it's his journey of, man, you're not in the kitchen, you're not in the garden, you're not in the stars, but it comes to this beautiful conclusion that because he's alive, his mother and his little brother live in him, and the way he lives his life honors their memory, and that we're all alive. But there's a deeper notion to it. Long answer to a simple question, but the deeper notion to this book, maybe we're all shouting, "Where are you?" Maybe even to the divine, "Where are you in my life?" And yet, if that exists in each of us, and we are that, then it's alive and well in everything we see, in every person we see. Uh, Maybe if we could really look at each other, we would see the divine in each other and solve the whole mystery of where's God. Maybe it's within each and every one of us, and we're manifestations of that. This overwhelming thought of love. If we could lock arms and walk together and say, let's walk each other home, and let's choose love over all the other things, uh, gosh, maybe heaven's right here if we create it that way.